Hey everyone, it's Ornlu, and oh boy, has it been a long time, but we are back here with my campaign review and tier list series. Believe it or not, the Last Chieftains DLC is the very first expansion for AoE2 to release what I would consider to be at least quite close to regular traditional campaigns, since the Mountain Royals came out on October 31st of 2023, which as of making this video is almost 2.5 years ago. Since then, the game has received plenty of single-player content, and I have done reviews for everything, but they just never felt quite comparable to the rest of the AoE2 campaign gallery. We've had 2 Chronicles DLCs, which were both pretty fun, but fundamentally indifferent in structure and content than normal medieval AoE2 campaigns. We also had the 3 Kingdoms DLC, which I considered to be another major departure from classic AoE2. The UI was different, the narrative structure and gameplay were far more focused on heroes and a retelling of historical fiction rather than a retelling of history. My hope was that we would then return to traditional AoE2 campaigns and subsequent expansions, focused on the rise and fall of major figures throughout medieval history, without being as character-driven as the 3 Kingdoms, as expansive or anachronistic as Chronicles, or featuring the more cinematic and decisions-based gameplay of either. Well, The Last Chieftains does contain some of those aspects to a degree, which we will cover in a moment, but this most recent expansion is at least enough of a return to normalcy that I feel comfortable comparing them to the main campaigns of the game. All of this is to say that it has been a while since we have visited the campaign review and tier list series, and since these videos are one of the main reasons many of you guys started watching my channel in the first place, I thought it would be beneficial to do an update video for 2026, because we have a fair bit of housekeeping to cover before we jump into the reviews for Lautaro, Arariboya, and Eldorado. So if you are excited for a return to this series after a long hiatus, be sure to let me know in the comments, and of course like the video and subscribe to the channel and all that other YouTube sellout stuff. With that said, let's get a refresher. The tier list. I want to start with a refresher on the tier list itself, as although it's just a modification of a regular S through D tier maker list, I still want to explain the criteria and characteristics for the campaigns on each tier. As a reminder, this is all my subjective opinion based on my many years of experience playing and reviewing this game, so feel free to disagree. Nevertheless, considering the tiers. So for those who don't remember, I ended up splitting the S and A tiers back in 2023, as when I first conceived this series, there were far fewer campaigns in the game, and the disparity in quality was much greater. This meant that over the years, the top end of the tier list became quite crowded, as AoE2 kept getting expansions, and most of the new campaigns were at least pretty good. Because of this increase in quantity and quality, I decided to parse the top 2 tiers into half steps, as it were. For the S tier, these are obviously the very best campaigns in AoE2 in my opinion, as each have all of the qualities you can ask for in a single-player AoE2 experience. A compelling story, memorable characters, engaging gameplay, and a reasonable challenge. Even so, I added the S+ tier as, in my mind, there were several campaigns that really stood out as iconic in AoE2. Barbarossa, Genghis Khan, and Attila the Hun are almost always campaigns that come to people's minds when they are asked about their favorites in the game, and with good reason. Yes, nostalgia is very strong, we don't need to pretend that it isn't, but there are important reasons as to why people love them so much. The gameplay is definitely simple, and in many cases dated, but that is more than made up for by the extremely memorable stories, AI factions, and fantastic voice acting / SFX of the original ensemble team. In addition to those, the 2 most recent Lord Bassi campaigns of Jadwiga and Rajendra are almost universally considered modern favorites, as they have both the excellent storytelling and characters of the old campaigns, but with the modern and diverse gameplay features that represent over 2.5 decades of scenario refinement. This left the Hotvies, Kotian Khan, Tamerlane, the Grand Dukes, and Tamar in the regular S tier. Of course, I talk at length about those campaigns in their respective sections, but broadly speaking, all of these campaigns are what I would consider well-crafted, but lack something especially memorable that would make them iconic. The Altvies have interesting scenarios, but a muddled story of multiple protagonists. Kotian Khan has a really unique progression where the player gets weaker over the course of the campaign, but lacks any truly memorable characters or dialogue. Tamerlane was a fun romp of Eurasian destruction, but its 4th and 6th scenarios were not the most compelling. The Grand Dukes set up a memorable narrative structure where you act as the foil of the Joan of Arc campaign, but lacked any iconic scenarios. Lastly, Tamar was a creative breath of fresh air for the Georgians, but it felt a little short with gameplay that was somewhat over-reliant on spamming Monospa. Still, all of those were minor quibbles in the grand scheme of things. Moving on to the A tier, I spliced it into A and A-, as I felt that some of the campaigns were overall fun, but possessed certain issues that brought them closer to B tier than S tier. For the regular A tier, Saladin, Dracula, Algirdas and Keshtutis, Janjishka, and Thoros were all solid options, and only had a few minor issues that held them away from the top rankings. Saladin had an amazing story and characters, but the gameplay was a bit dated relative to Genghis Khan and Barbarossa. Dracula had some fun scenarios and memorable characters, but it lacked quite a bit in terms of polish and cohesion, in part due to all of the civ switching. Algirdas and Keshtutis also had great characters and a compelling narrative, but the scenarios were a bit one-dimensional. Basically the same for Janjishka as well. Thoros himself was not very memorable, but the Reynald de Chatillon narrative was fantastic, and the levels themselves were quite strong. For A-, like I said, these campaigns tended to have larger issues. Basically, all of them were very good in some aspects, and very underwhelming in others. Bari had some interesting gameplay, but a forgettable and fictitious story that left people clamoring for an actual Byzantines campaign. Prithviraj had fun characters and diverse scenarios, but still felt too short to tell you the story it was trying to convey. Sunjata had a fantastic campaign arc of gradually building your power over time, but had exactly zero notable characters, including Sunjata himself. Gajah was great all around, except for the final scenario, which unfortunately left a sour taste for many players. Devapala had strong Buddhist representation in its story, and was a great introduction to the Dynasties of India DLC, but was way too simple and easy. Ismail suffered a similar issue of being too simple, but was also too short for such a major historical figure, even though Ismail himself was a fantastic foil to his contemporary Babur. Speaking of which, with the B tier and below, the campaigns really begin to have some major issues. Alaric was generally middle of the road in gameplay and narrative, although it did end stronger than it started. Suryavarman had only the barest bones of a story, but Khmer elephants went brrr. Ivilo had some really cool gameplay ideas, but also felt short and disjointed. Joan of Arc is about as classic a campaign as it gets, but its gameplay is painfully dated. Almeida was an interesting trot around the ocean, but had a muddled story. Bayanog spent a lot of time before Bayanog was actually ruling, leaving the entire second half feeling incredibly rushed. Meanwhile, Babur was another campaign that felt too grand for only 5 scenarios, especially with a scenario starting as the Tatars with an inconsistently written protagonist. Still, all of these campaigns were at least solid additions. The C-tier campaigns were generally quite underwhelming, and all of them lacked memorable gameplay, but they still had some redeeming qualities. El Cid is a classic story with great characters, but the gameplay is way too bare bones even for AOC. Longshank started out really strong, but ended on 3 very repetitive scenarios. Loi had some fun Vietnamese versus Chinese gameplay, and also some very not fun and repetitive Vietnamese versus Chinese gameplay, and basically no narrative. Sforza was a perfect opportunity for a more RPG-style mercenary campaign, but the RPG-style missions were buggy, and the build and destroy scenarios were forgettable. Montezuma had arguably the best ambiance and immersion of any campaign in the game, but generally lacked any memorable gameplay. Lastly, the D tier. Ugh. I hate to be hard on campaigns that obviously had a lot of time and energy put into them, but they really just did not have any major redeeming qualities. Tariq bin Ziyad, yeah, I don't need to say anything else there. Yodit was arguably the worst narrative in the game, as you had an unsympathetic destroyer of Ethiopia with poorly executed gameplay ideas. And Pachacuti, well, we will get to that in a little bit. But guys, that was my speedrun of the tiers and the reasons for the campaigns placed within them. Honestly, I think it speaks well to AoE2 that, in my critical estimation, around 75% of the huge single-player catalog is fun and worth playing, even if you aren't a huge AoE2 fan like I am. The Three Kingdoms. Alright, so I know I already did my threefold review of the Three Kingdoms DLC, so my extensive thoughts are already explored there, but I want to talk about the expansion in relation to this tier list. When I asked Folder of Doom to update the tier list for the new campaigns, he wanted to know if he should include the Three Kingdoms. This intrigued me because at the time of making the reviews for the 3K campaigns, I thought it would just be a standalone thing and not like any future DLCs, so I abstained from comparing them to the existing campaigns. The UI was different, it featured choices that applied to future scenarios, it involved numerous hero units with activated abilities, and covered the same timeline from 3 different perspectives, and like I mentioned earlier, it felt more like an adaptation of historical fiction rather than of history itself. And yet, with the next DLC, The Last Chieftains, the UI is retained from 3K, as is the decisions carrying over into future levels mechanics. So I need to ask myself, am I really keeping the Three Kingdoms stuff off the tier list because I did not not like the subject matter, or because they were actually different enough? Well, upon self-reflection, I have come to the decisive conclusion of yes and no. Yes, the campaigns are in many ways fundamentally different, and had no future DLCs been added, I would have been content with keeping 3K separate. But obviously they have, and I think I need to now place them on the tier list. Therefore, I will now place all 3 of the Three Kingdoms campaigns, Liu Bei, Cao Cao, and Sun Jian, all on the tier list at once. And they will all decisively go into the C tier. I will link the threefold review in the description of this video for further details, but TLDW, the stories were bland and the context muddled, the gameplay was fairly average with a couple of good missions in there, and the characters were pretty hit or miss. I would rather not dwell on that expansion any longer, so with their inclusion into the regular tier list, I believe we can put the Three Kingdoms to bed for this channel. Considering the new UI and decisions mechanics. Before we go to South America and Pachacuti, I want to briefly talk about the UI changes to the modern campaigns, as well as the mechanics where you have decisions impact future missions. Starting with the UI changes, this is always going to be super subjective, but I really don't like any of the changes, and I have no idea why the devs felt the need to fix something that wasn't an issue. When it comes to the campaign menu, AoE2 has always featured unique pins dropped on a map, including a pin to get to each campaign among all of the others on a world map, and then pins for each mission that appear as you complete the scenarios on a regional map. As far as I know, there has never been any substantial criticism for this UI, and I know that I have personally never seen any desire to change it from my viewers. But for some reason, the devs chose to overhaul this system, starting with the Three Kingdoms, but continuing it with the Last Chieftains. First, there's no longer a world map, but rather tabs that a player can jump between to select a campaign with the hero's face on it. Getting rid of the world map is, to me, odd, because it helps the player contextualize where the campaign is taking place, both in terms of real-world location and the other campaigns. For example, if you are unfamiliar with South American geography or history, you would be hard-pressed to figure out where Lautaro takes place, in modern-day Chile, and you would not have any context that this campaign is on the other end of the Andes from the Muisca and across the mountains and jungles from the Tupi. It's not major, but it feels like a regression for no reason. Then, with the additional UI of the graphics and arrows moving around the map and each scenario having its own set of boxes and whatnot, I don't know, but this to me feels like it's straight out of a mobile game and needlessly busy, and like it's trying hard to get the player's attention, like they're scrolling on their phone and not sitting at their PC. It's all very cartoony, but again, subjective. Another relatively minor interface change is the addition of tons of visual indicators as to what you're supposed to do. You have map revealers all over the place showing you objectives, markings on the minimap telling you where to go, and of course the giant flashing circles that highlight specific objectives. To me, this takes you out of the organic playing and discovering experience to give you a not subtle message of, you are playing a video game, go do this. I obviously exaggerate slightly, but you get the idea. Concerning the decisions mechanic, I do feel like it was toned back in the Last Chieftains relative to Three Kingdoms, and it's certainly not bad, but the choices feel very superficial and non-impactful. I'm not talking about the El Dorado story choices here, that will be for the El Dorado video, but choices of getting some extra soldiers versus another, or having slightly faster farming versus mining, etc. You don't have the extra random heroes like in Three Kingdoms, but these decisions feel like complexity for the sake of complexity, without really adding anything to the gameplay experience. Who cares if you start with 10 elite skirmishers instead of 10 pikemen when you are training hundreds of units anyway? The whole system feels like it's designed to be unintrusive, but then like, what's the point of it in the first place? Either add it in with big, meaningful decisions, or not at all. Lastly, for this section, I do want to end on a positive note, and that is the hero implementation in the Last Chieftains. Back in AOC, when you got a hero at all, they usually needed to survive, so you would just plop them in the castle and then never use them. Not great. In later campaigns, you would get the heroes respawning for free when they died after a short timer. That also did not feel great. With this expansion, they struck a nice balance where you can retrain heroes for a small cost at the town center, encouraging the player to utilize their heroes, but not to be frivolous with them. A good compromise all around. I could do without the aura effects because it feels like it pulls you away from the intended unit interactions you get with regular gameplay, but again, that's pretty minor. Let's move on. Pachacuti. Our last order of business before getting into the Last Chieftains campaigns is the reworking of the existing Inca campaign Pachacuti. Although not a new DLC civ, Incas receive a reasonable rework to put them more in line with their South American relatives as opposed to their more distant Central American ones. As you would then expect, the Pachacuti campaign got some retooling to accommodate the new Inca units, bonuses, as well as adding the new Gaia objects from the expansion and changing the civs of many AI players. Getting to the campaign itself, you have to remember that Pachacuti, 1438 to 1470, was actually introduced to the game with DE in 2019, despite the game claiming it came from the Forgotten expansion. This is because Pachacuti actually replaces the El Dorado campaign from HD as the Inca's representation in the game. There are many reasons that the HD El Dorado was not ported over to DE, or even reworked like Alaric, Sforza, Bari, and Prithviraj, but we need not go into that now. Suffice to say, Pachacuti was a far better representation for the Inca civilization, which follows the rise of the Inca Empire centered in the Andes Mountains of modern-day Peru and its subjugations of the surrounding peoples. This immediately puts it in sharp contrast with the Montezuma campaign, which begins with the Aztec Empire already at its height, and then is focused then on the interaction between the old world and the new. With that said, let's dive into the scenarios. Starting things off for the Incas, a new power arises, covers the origins of the Inca Empire, as Viracocha must obtain the blessing of the gods by capturing 3 of the 4 relic carts from the surrounding tribes. Starting with a small village in a mountain valley surrounded by 2 rivers, the Inca are just one of several small tribes in the area, and far from the most powerful. The Quechua and Tambos are nearby, but are fairly weak, while the Cuyos and Chanca are your more dangerous enemies and are located to the west and north respectively. The Cuyos, Chanca, and Tambos each have a relic cart in their town, with the last one being hidden away in an island to the northwest. The Quechua are an optional player that can be bribed or intimidated into joining you. Lastly, you can snag some important Imperial Age technologies from the trade workshops of your opponents. Alright, so A New Power Arises was already a solid intro scenario to the Inca back when DE came out, as it did a nice job of showing how the Inca gained power by conquering the enemy tribes. It could be very grindy, however, as you are stuck in the Castle Age, and if you don't find the trade workshops, you likely had a very tough time cracking the Cuyos or Chanca. That brings us to the most important Last Chieftains change of this scenario, which was to dramatically reduce the defenses of the Cuyos and Chanca, making them much easier to conquer. They also added plenty of Gaia doodads and switched the civs of the Cuyos and the Tambos to Mapuche, and the Chanca to the Tupi, which adds a nice little bit of variety. The level is now much easier than back when DE came out, but the overall experience is quite solid. The Incas find themselves on the back foot in the second scenario, the Field of Blood. Now established as a regional power, the Inca capital of Cusco is besieged by the rival Chanca tribe. After a couple of cutscenes, and now old Viracocha and his son Urku flee the capital to hide in the mountains, leaving the defense of the city to his other son, Kusi Yupanqui, who is also helped by his generals Apomaita and Vikakirao. As you might expect, this is a full defense mission, as much like El Cid 5, you need to defend your ally as they attempt to build a wonder, but with the further constraint of also needing to defend its 200-year countdown. The Inca do have allies in the region with the Kana and Kanchi, and they will tribute you resources if they are alive, but they are both super weak and will die without support. Meanwhile, the Chanca have military camps to the west and east, and their leader Anku Hualak commands the elite troops from the south. I gotta say, back when DE came out, and I did not have many kind things to say about the Pachacuti campaign, even then, I was a big fan of the Field of Blood scenario and considered it the strongest in the campaign. A full defense mission is really appropriate when showcasing the AoE2 Incas, who are inherently the most defensive of the New World civs, with cheap stone fortifications and cheap and efficient counter units, as well as a broad tech tree. In addition, this scenario back at launch was tough, as the Chanca threw tons of units at you, forcing your defenses and army compositions to be on point. You also had just enough resources on the map to afford your stone defenses and gold units, so it didn't feel too spammy or grindy. From a narrative perspective, I thought the reveal of Kusa Yupanqui being named Pachacuti when the mission ended was a really interesting way of introducing the campaign's protagonist. Speaking now to the recent changes, like the last level, there were plenty of graphical updates with the new South American assets, and the Chanca remained the Tupi civilization throughout the campaign. It really is quite nice to not have this campaign be all mirror matches, even if historical liberties have to be taken. It's also a minor thing, but the 2 Chanca factions were renamed and recolored to be distinct, which I appreciate. On the downside, this mission was made significantly easier. Cusco has way more villagers than before, meaning they finish the wonder faster, meaning you don't need to defend anywhere near as long. I'm not too sure about other AI changes, but everything about this level just felt like a breeze compared to the launch version, which is kind of disappointing. In the third scenario, War of Brothers, Pachacuti must lead his forces into the mountains to defeat his cowardly brother Urku, who abandoned Cusco in its hour of need. In this limited economy A to B-ish scenario, you start with Pachacuti and a large army to the west, and must kill Urku in his fortress of Kalas in the far east. You have no economy to speak of, so you must supplement your army by finding the scattered Inca soldiers throughout the many mountain passes of the map, and your economy by doing the same with the scattered villagers. All throughout the mountains are the Inca rebels, who you have to defeat piecemeal before reaching Kalas. The fun really starts there, as Kalas will send unending waves of units at you while you grind them down with ranged units, towers, and siege. Alright, so back when DE first came out, this was one of the most poorly balanced scenarios in all of AoE2. Like, it was bad. You had a limited eco versus infinite unit spam, and had to destroy a well-fortified base with castle age units, 2 capped rams, and 2 onagers. It took a couple of hours in-game when I first played this level. That said, even before the last chieftains, the scenario was reworked so that you could then build a siege workshop to train additional rams and onagers, which helped the grindiness feeling quite a bit. Narratively, this scenario is fine and works well as a follow-up to the previous level, although it would be nice if Urku had a bit of dialogue. Like the other scenarios, the recent changes to War of Brothers made the mission much easier, as Urku sends far fewer units out to attack you. This actually makes the first 80% of the level very easy, because so long as you keep your army together, you will easily dispatch all of the troops in your way. The ending with the Siege of Kalas is very similar to the reworked version previously, except the enemy citadel has no gates to stop your units from running in. I guess we can say that the scenario went from being painful to unmemorable, which is technically an upgrade. With Pachacuti's power consolidated, the fourth scenario brings our protagonist back to the Chanka in the Falcon's Tent. Vikakirao arrives with a small force to the south of the map, as does Apomaita to the east, and together they must defeat the Chanka once and for all. The enemy capital of Wamankarpa lies to the far north, and the scenario is won by destroying their 4 castles. However, there are a lot of mountains and jungles between you and there, and the map is crawling with enemies. Ankuhualak leads the elite Chanka forces once again, this time from a fortress in the center. Defeating him will reduce the morale of the enemy soldiers, but also importantly allow your 2 forces to meet up. Additionally, the cities of Abancay to the east and Andahuaylas to the west support the Chanka, and you will need to defeat one of them as well. Lastly, there are a couple of side objectives, like the Kola tribe, who you can coordinate an attack with against Ankuhualak, and some priests who will give you some relics and monks in exchange for villagers. So back in ye olde days, the Falcon's Tent was a very annoying and grindy scenario, as you started with very little, the map was huge, and you had a ton of enemies with infinite resources, and you had a small-ish population of 160. All 4 of the enemy factions felt very samey, as they were all Imperial Age Incas, and the mission itself was just not memorable. Narratively, it was a nice showdown with the Chanka, but since they never had any dialogue in the first place, they weren't super memorable as an enemy. When it came to the recent changes, once again the mission was made a fair bit easier, as now the player can go all the way up to 200 population, and the enemy cities and fortresses are far less well fortified. The Chanka are once again swapped over to the Tupi, which does help a little bit in terms of adding some variety to your enemies. Other than that, the mission is actually quite similar to its previous version. I will say that I appreciated the unique map architecture more when I wasn't butting up against infinite unit spam, but nevertheless, not the most memorable scenario. Last in the Inca campaign, a now old Pachacuti passes the torch to his son Topa Yupanqui in Like Father Like Son. The kingdom of Timor is the last major rival to the Inca, and Topa Yupanqui intends to prove himself a worthy successor to his father by defeating them. You begin with a large army to the south of the map, and must first establish a base of operations. The city of Pachacamac to the west is an ideal candidate, but they just don't feel like helping you, so you have to snipe their 4 chieftains to change their minds. From there, you can begin your war with the Chimu, who have 5 Imperial Age players all bearing down on you. Their navy will harass you from the coast, their capital of Chanchan to the far north is what you need to conquer by sending 15 units to their wonder, and they have 3 additional armies stationed around cisterns to the east. Defeating all of these side factions primarily gives you the benefit of reducing the amount of unit spam heading your way, but in particular, destroying the navy gives you a bunch of resources, and taking the cisterns reduces the number of soldiers Chanchan can train. So back when DE came out, I was not very kind to Like Father Like Son. It felt very similar to the previous mission, being a big Imperial Age build and destroy scenario where you start to the south of the map, have a big enemy capital to the north, and several smaller enemy factions in between. Back then, all of the other players were still Incas, further increasing this samey feeling. On top of that, the mission was even grindier than the Falcon's Tent, and was overall a very frustrating way to close out the campaign. It didn't help that capturing the cisterns gave you no obvious advantage. Yeah, it was not a great mission. That said, this was probably the most improved scenario in this campaign with the last chieftains. You now get 200 pop limit instead of 175, which helps with the grindiness aspect, and the enemies are now all Muisca, which helps with the repetitiveness aspect. It's also more clear that the cisterns reduce the number of units Chan Chan can produce, although I think it would have been more interesting if, by reducing their water, it reduced the enemy unit's attack or HP or something. There's also, once again, the small nice touch where you don't have 3 players in the same name and same color, as the cistern guards now have unique names and colors. It just helps with readability. I'm not going to sit here and say Like Father, Like Son is an amazing scenario, but it is at least now a satisfying one with which to end the Inca campaign. Okay, so now for the broader analysis bit, I will summarize my thoughts back then with Pachacuti, and then consider how the update changed my perceptions, if at all, and then possibly replace the campaign on the tier list. Back in October of 2021, I was not at all a fan of the campaign and placed it in the D tier, putting it alongside Yodit and Tariq ibn Ziyad as the weakest in all of AoE2. I had 2 main complaints back then, and that was the lack of diversity and grindy gameplay. As mentioned, Pachacuti was the only campaign in all of AoE2 to only feature one civilization, and that led to a ton of repetitive interactions, especially as the campaign wore on. Relatedly, Pachacuti was full of infinite unit spam, which really bogged down the final 3 scenarios. Boring, repetitive, and frustrating gameplay were the dubious hallmarks of this campaign, and fundamentally why I placed it in the lowest tier. Furthermore, I didn't talk about it back then, but the story was not a strength of this campaign. The overarching progression of the rise of the Inca Empire was fine. Here I'm specifically referring to the narration, writing, voice acting, etc. Here, let me show you a side-by-side comparison of Montezuma, the other American campaign, with Pachacuti.
Passed down to you by Cuauhtémoc, eagle warrior of Tenochtitlan. An omen appeared above the forest, the shape of an ear of corn, but blazing like daybreak. It seemed to bleed fire, drop by drop, like a wound in the sky. I am a warrior, not a priest, and knew not what to make of such a sign. I consulted with the seers and magicians to see if another great war was coming, but they answered only in riddles. The gods want more sacrifice, was their answer. That was always their answer. Much of our empire of rainforests and volcanoes has been conquered in the name of sacrifice. The magicians tell us that we must make a sacrifice every single day for the sun to continue to rise.
So, you want to know why this region is called the Field of Blood? The old man peered over in astonishment from his seat in the shadow of his stone hut. He smiled mischievously as he continued. You're probably not from here. If you were, you would not have asked such a question. I nodded in affirmation, for the old man was right. I was a merchant from the south. It is the first time that my path has led to Cusco, the heart of the Inca Empire, I explained. You are fortunate that you have chosen to rest in my village, my young and illiterate friend, the old man told me, rising and pointing to the entrance of his dwelling.
Yeah, isn't that a stark contrast? The vivid imagery, music, and SFX in Montezuma do such a great job of immersing the player into the setting of the new world, whereas Pachacuti just does not. The twist of Apomaita being the narrator at the end of the campaign also fell completely flat, considering neither him nor Vikakirao were memorable in any way in the first place. That said, I did praise the focus on unit diversity and defenses that are the hallmarks of the Inca civilization, as the player is really encouraged to use those counter units effectively against everything your opponents throw at you, and the defenses keep you alive and anchor a slow push. It's still very unfortunate that you can't use the anti-cavalry aspect of Kamyux, but nevertheless, it was the high point. But what now? Well, at the very least, the cosmetic changes throughout all of the scenarios were very much appreciated, as the South American setting is so much more vivid now than in the past. Furthermore, some of the previous issues were rectified. Enemy civilizations were changed around, and the overall gameplay was made much less grindy. I will say that it was unfortunate that we didn't really get to fight different civs at the same time, as other than the first mission, every enemy was always the same civ. Reducing the grindiness was nice in making the campaign more enjoyable, although I do think they went a little too far in making the gameplay easy, even on hard difficulty. Overall, the gameplay is not radically different post Last Chieftains, and the story and narration are exactly the same, and yet I would say it is a net improvement. But when it comes to the tier list, does the Inca campaign deserve a bump up from the D tier? I would say yes. Pachacuti now feels decisively better than Yodit and Tariq ibn Ziyad, and I will place it in the C tier. I'm not going to go any higher than that for all of the reasons I've mentioned, but I still think it's at least an okay playing experience, and no longer feels painful like it used to. Let me know what you think of the Pachacuti changes in the comments. With that, I have officially caught up on all things AoE2 campaign review and tier list for 2026. I know this video is kind of just a random hodgepodge of different topics, but I wanted to cover them all before I jumped into the Last Chieftains campaigns. Those videos should hopefully be coming very soon, but we'll see how quickly I can get them out. Lastly, for this video, I do need to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters, with Dan and Jared in the Great Wolf tier, and Lucan Egg Product, Carolyn, Tanduri Knight, Kryru, and Dieter in the Dire Wolf tier. But as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.